Donald Trump just banned Canada. Not a tariff, not a threat. A ban. A sitting American president opened Truth Social at 9:03 in the morning and posted 47 words declaring a complete suspension of all non-essential trade and travel between the United States and its single largest trading partner. $2 billion in daily commerce. 9 million American jobs directly or indirectly supported. 70 years of integrated economic architecture, built through 2 world wars, a Cold War, a global pandemic, and every crisis in between. Gone. Gone in a tweet with a 72-hour clock attached. Welcome to Prime Update, where you get new updates every day. Mark Carney was at a live podium when it happened. A journalist read the tweet aloud into the room, and what Carney did in the next 60 seconds, on camera, on every major international broadcast feed, simultaneously, in front of the assembled press corps of Canada and the world, produced a moment so constitutionally precise, so strategically devastating, and so immediately consequential that within 40 minutes the dollar had weakened. Gold had risen. 3 G7 finance ministers had called Ottawa, and a Republican Senate committee chairman had gone on record questioning whether the President of the United States had the legal authority to do what he had just announced. Let that sink in. A foreign prime minister corrected a sitting American president on live television, and the global financial system, in 20 minutes, confirmed the prime minister was right. What is happening right now is not a trade dispute. It is not a negotiation. It is a live constitutional crisis unfolding in full public view on international television in real time, with consequences radiating outward into every allied capital, every financial market, and every corner of the rules-based international order that the United States spent 70 years building and is now, in the span of a single social media post, actively dismantling. When a prime minister of a G7 nation calmly explains on live television that a presidential tweet has no legal standing under domestic law, international treaty law, or World Trade Organization rules, and financial markets confirm his analysis within 20 minutes, the credibility architecture of American executive power has entered territory it has never been in before. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this is the story that defines what comes next, and you will not want to have missed the coverage. So what exactly detonated this moment? On March 25th, 2026, at 9:03 a.m. Eastern, Donald Trump posted to Truth Social. The full text read, "Canada has been ripping off the United States for years. Enough. I am hereby announcing a complete ban on all non-essential trade and travel between the United States and Canada, effective in 72 hours unless Canada signs our framework agreement immediately. No more games. America first." 47 words. No statute cited. No emergency declaration filed. No consultation with the Office of the United States Trade Representative. No briefing of the Senate Finance Committee or the House Ways and Means Committee. The 2 congressional bodies whose constitutional authority over trade is explicit and unambiguous. No formal diplomatic transmission to the Canadian Embassy in Washington or the Canadian High Commission. A social media post carrying the identical legal infrastructure of a post about a weekend golf score, purporting to suspend the largest bilateral trading relationship in human history. The relationship that has never been interrupted, not by World War II, not by the Korean War, not by Vietnam, not by September 11th, not by the 2008 financial crisis, not by a global pandemic that killed millions. None of those events interrupted U.S.-Canada trade for a single day. A tweet posted at 9:03 on a Tuesday morning was apparently going to accomplish what none of them could. This is not just another political controversy. Canada supplies 60% of American crude oil imports. Canada heats millions of American homes in the Northeast and Midwest with natural gas. Canada powers New York, Vermont, Maine, and Minnesota with hydroelectric electricity delivered under long-term contracts. Canada is the single largest export market for American goods of any nation on Earth. The framework agreement the tweet demanded Canada sign, described by sources familiar with its contents as requiring Canada to surrender independent monetary policy, accept American regulatory standards across 14 industry sectors, and withdraw every pending USMCA dispute panel challenge, was not a negotiating position. It was a demand for capitulation dressed in the language of commerce. And believe me, when a prime minister hears that demand read aloud on live international television and responds the way Mark Carney responded, you know that what comes next is not what the person who sent the tweet expected. Here's the full picture of what had been building to this moment. The trajectory from tariff escalation to trade ban had been accelerating for weeks, driven by Canada's sovereign energy declaration, the rejected wheat demand, the auto tariff confrontation, the surprise agricultural technology partnership announcement, and a series of USMCA dispute panel filings that had collectively constructed a legal record of American treaty violations so comprehensive that Ottawa's Trade Council described it internally as the most documented case of executive branch treaty breach in the agreement's history. But the proximate trigger came on March 22nd, 2026. when Canada's USMCA auto tariff challenge was accepted for expedited review by the Dispute Panel Secretariat. A procedural development the White House counsel's office apparently had not anticipated. The United States was now formally a respondent in an international legal proceeding, operating on its own independent timeline, on its own rules, entirely outside the reach of executive action or social media declaration. According to reporting from the Washington Post and the Financial Times, the panel acceptance landed in the White House counsel's office on the morning of March 22nd and produced an internal reaction that sources described as incandescent. 3 days later, the tweet went out. Multiple sources familiar with the internal sequence described the ban announcement not as a calculated strategic escalation, but as a reactive impulse, the response of an administration that had run through its toolkit without producing compliance and reached for the largest available blunt instrument in the belief that the sheer scale of the threat would substitute for the coherence of a legal strategy. They were wrong. And what happened when that belief collided with Mark Carney standing at a live podium is the entire story. Smash that like button right now. Because what I'm about to walk you through is going to reframe everything you think you understand about where this confrontation actually stands. And here's where it really gets serious. At 9:03 a.m. on March 25th, the tweet posted, Mark Carney was midway through a live press conference on Canadian housing policy at the National Press Theatre in Ottawa. CBC, CTV, Global News, BBC World, CNN International, Reuters, all carrying the feed live. Laura Stone of the Globe and Mail received an alert on her phone, raised her hand, and read the tweet aloud into the room. The room went completely silent. Every camera was already live. There was no recess. There was no aide stepping forward to whisper in Carney's ear. There was no break in the broadcast. There was just a prime minister standing at a podium on live international television who had 4 seconds to decide how to respond to being told, in a tweet, that his country had been banned. He did not look down at notes. He did not ask to see a copy of the post. He took one visible breath, and he spoke. I've seen it. Carney's voice carried the specific quality of calm that central bank governors develop over years of managing financial crisis in public. The tone that communicates to markets and to counterparties simultaneously that the situation is understood, that the response is considered, and that panic is not a parameter being entertained. Let me respond directly. Every camera in the room tightened on his face. A tweet is not a law, Carney said. A social media post does not constitute a legal instrument under American domestic law, under international treaty law, or under the rules of the World Trade Organization. Pause. Canada will not be responding to a tweet. Canada will be responding to whatever formal legal instrument the United States chooses to transmit through proper diplomatic channels, if one exists. If none exists, there's nothing to respond to. A second journalist raised her hand immediately. Prime Minister, are you saying Canada is simply ignoring the President of the United States? Carney turned toward her without hesitation. I am saying, he replied, that Canada applies the same standard to American communications that we apply to all sovereign communications. If it is a formal instrument with legal standing, we respond formally. If it is a social media post with no legal standing, we note it and continue governing. Today, Canada is continuing to govern. Drop a comment right now if that answer did what I think it did to every person watching that feed. I read every single one. What happened in the 40 minutes following that exchange was, by the assessment of every financial analyst and diplomatic observer tracking the broadcast, genuinely without modern precedent in the context of allied government relations. The dollar weakened 1.3% against a basket of major currencies within 20 minutes of the clip being distributed on financial news terminals. Gold rose, Treasury yields moved. The reaction was not to Canada's words in isolation. It was to the specific, simultaneous combination of a presidential communication that bond markets recognized as legally incoherent and a prime ministerial response that bond markets recognized as legally grounded. When those two signals arrive on the same story from the same live feed, professional traders do not wait for editorial analysis. They price the gap. 3 G7 finance ministers, Germany's, France's, and Japan's, called Ottawa within 40 minutes. Diplomatic sources familiar with those calls described the message as identical across all three. Canada had the legal high ground. The international community was watching. And the procedural approach Canada had been building through USMCA dispute mechanisms was the correct one. The British Foreign Secretary issued a public statement within the hour describing the tweet as deeply concerning and reaffirming British commitment to the rules-based international trading order. The European Union Trade Commissioner convened an emergency coordination call with counterparts from Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand before noon. These were not adversaries organizing against America. These were American allies coordinating responses to an American executive action before lunch on the day it was announced. A presidential social media post has no legal effect whatsoever. This is not a political opinion. It is a constitutional fact. A tweet is not an executive order. It is not a presidential proclamation. It is not a national emergency declaration. It is not a formal diplomatic communication. Under American law, trade restrictions of the scope Trump described require either a formal presidential action, citing specific statutory authority, or an act of Congress. The statutory authorities available for presidential trade action each carry procedural requirements that constrain both the speed and the scope of what the executive branch can do. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, i.e. EPA, requires a formal declaration of national emergency and a finding that a foreign threat to American national security, foreign policy, or economy exists, formally declaring Canada a national security threat. Canada, a NATO ally, a NORAD partner, a Five Eyes intelligence partner, the country that shares the longest peaceful border on Earth with the United States. That would require a presidential determination so legally aggressive that constitutional scholars described it universally as certain to face immediate federal court challenge, likely to be met with a pre-implementation injunction, and guaranteed to produce an allied government reaction that would make every prior episode in this confrontation look restrained. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, the National Security Tariff Authority previously used for steel and aluminum, had already been deployed and legally challenged. Extending it to a comprehensive trade ban would amplify those challenges exponentially. Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 requires an investigation and formal findings process that takes months, not 72 hours. There was no clean statutory vehicle for what the tweet described. What there was a 72-hour clock ticking toward an expiration that the White House counsel's office was scrambling in real time to delay. Lawrence Tribe, professor emeritus of constitutional law at Harvard Law School, told MSNBC on the afternoon of March 25th that a trade ban imposed by social media post citing no statutory authority and no emergency declaration has precisely zero legal effect until converted into a formal instrument, and that the administration's apparent failure to prepare that instrument before making the announcement suggests either impulsive action or a profound miscalculation of how Canada would respond. He stated that Carney's reply was constitutionally accurate in every specific particular, and that markets were right to treat it as the more legally reliable signal of the two. Don't go anywhere, because Trump's response to Carney's live rebuttal is the most explosive detail in this entire story, and it tells you everything about what the West Wing understood and didn't understand about what had just happened to them. Trump's counter-response came at 11:47 a.m. A Truth Social post calling Carney a smug globalist puppet, insisting the ban was absolutely legal and would be fully implemented, claiming Canada's economy was already collapsing, and promising additional unspecified actions within 48 hours. No new legal detail, no statutory authority cited, no implementation mechanism described, legally identical in weight to the original tweet, which is to say none. The dollar weakened another 0.4% after that post. Gold ticked up again. The market was no longer even performing the ritual of treating the communications as credible legal instruments. It was pricing them as political noise, generating economic side effects. And the side effects, notably, were falling entirely on the American side of the border. American consumers facing supply uncertainty. American businesses consulting lawyers about contingency planning. American credibility absorbing the reputational cost of a presidential ban that a prime minister had publicly, and accurately, described as legally meaningless on international television. This puts the administration in the most acute legal and political bind it has faced on trade policy since taking office. The bind has two sides. Neither side leads anywhere good. Following through, issuing a formal executive order, means choosing a statutory authority that faces immediate federal court challenge with a high probability of pre-implementation injunction. Producing the specific spectacle of a federal judge publicly adjudicating and potentially blocking the president's trade authority. For an administration whose entire political identity rests on dominance and winning, a federal judge saying no is not just embarrassing, it is foundationally corrosive. Not following through, allowing the 72-hour clock to expire without a formal legal instrument, confirms publicly and permanently what Carney said on live television. The tweet had no legal standing. Canada was right to ignore it. And every government on Earth that watched the exchange now knows that American economic threats delivered through social media can be safely categorized as political noise rather than sovereign communication. The deterrent collapses, the leverage evaporates, and the precedent Canada set, that a tweet is not a law, becomes available to every future target of American executive economic coercion. Legal and political analysts are calling this the most significant public exposure of the gap between presidential declaration and legal reality in the history of American trade policy. Elizabeth Goitein, co-director of the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice and the country's foremost authority on emergency powers law, told NPR on the evening of March 25th that the administration faces a choice between two outcomes that both damage executive credibility. a court challenge that publicly adjudicates the legal limits of presidential trade authority, or a clock expiration that demonstrates those limits without a court needing to say a word. Senate Finance Committee Chairman Mike Crapo went on record telling reporters that Congress's constitutional authority over trade was not subject to executive override by social media post, and that his committee would examine the legal basis of any formal instrument that followed. That is, a Republican chairman of a Republican committee telling a Republican president that he cannot ban Canada in a tweet. In the history of this administration's relationship with Capitol Hill, that statement lands with a weight that the people who run congressional relations in the West Wing understand immediately. So let's break down precisely what the world learned on March 25th. Because these lessons, once learned by allied governments and financial markets, do not get unlearned, regardless of what any subsequent post says. First, allied governments learned that a presidential economic threat delivered through social media can be publicly, accurately, and immediately characterized as legally meaningless by a G7 Prime Minister on live international television, and that markets will confirm that characterization within 20 minutes. That is a permanent data point in every finance ministry and trade ministry in every allied and non-allied capital on Earth. It updates every model of American reliability going forward, not just for this episode, for every episode that follows. Second, American businesses learned that the gap between presidential declaration and legal implementation is wide enough that an entire framework of announced trade restrictions can be constitutionally inoperative while appearing from a social media feed to be in effect. That uncertainty is itself an economic cost. It disrupts supply chain planning. It freezes investment decisions. It forces legal consultations that have billable hours attached. American businesses bear those costs, even when the tweet never becomes law. Third, and most consequentially for the long term, Canada learned that it can face down a presidential ban, characterize it accurately as a legal nullity on international television, and emerge with its international standing measurably enhanced. That lesson does not expire when this administration does. It becomes part of the institutional memory of the Canadian government and every allied government that watched it happen. The next time any administration applies executive economic pressure to any allied government, the March 25th playbook exists. The legal framework Carney deployed is documented. The international coordination response is established. The precedent is set. And it is not reversible. But beyond the legal clocks and the market reactions and the constitutional mechanics, this is really about something that will outlast every specific episode in this confrontation by decades. It is about whether the United States of America retains the institutional credibility, the legal discipline, and the strategic coherence to conduct foreign economic policy in a world where its allies have constructed alternatives. Its adversaries are taking notes, and financial markets have more analytical processing power than any communications team in any White House. China has said nothing publicly about March 25th. China does not need to. China is watching the United States discredit its own economic threats by delivering them through channels with no legal effect. Watching American allies coordinate responses to American executive action, watching the rules-based international trading architecture that 7 decades of American diplomatic investment built being publicly challenged by the country that built it. The strategic benefit to Beijing accrues without Beijing needing to act. Every time Washington makes a threat that turns out to be legally incoherent and strategically counterproductive, it makes the argument for the alternative order that Beijing has been quietly constructing. You do not need to be a China analyst to see the trajectory. You just need to watch what is happening and project it 6 months forward. The following is excerpted from a restricted circulation analysis prepared by the Geopolitical Risk Desk of a multilateral financial institution. Dated March 26, 2026. Distribution: G7, finance deputies only. The coalition that convened on the afternoon of March 25th, the EU, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, did not meet to express sympathy for Canada. They met to coordinate legal and economic responses to the pattern of American unilateral action that Canada's situation represents. Every government in that coalition has its own trade agreement with the United States. Every government in that coalition has its own exposure to the same kind of tweet-based economic pressure. Every government in that coalition is now running its own version of the analysis Carney's team completed months before this confrontation reached its current intensity. The institutional posture of American allies toward American economic commitments has permanently shifted. That shift does not reverse on its own. It reverses, if it reverses at all, through years of demonstrated reliability that directly contradicts the pattern currently being established. To minus 48 hours until clock expiration. The gap between presidential declaration and legal reality is now a structural feature of the international system. Stay with me. Because the final dimension of the story is the one Washington has not publicly grappled with. And it is the most consequential of all. Here is the complete strategic sequence when you step back and examine it as a single coherent arc. Trump imposed auto tariffs. Carney retaliated in 9 minutes. Trump threatened wheat access. Carney redirected supply to Japan and South Korea. Trump threatened energy tariffs. Carney declared energy independence and signed European LNG agreements. Trump issued an export sovereignty directive. Carney announced a pre-positioned alternative supply partnership covering 94% of the targeted categories, finalized 3 days before the directive landed. Trump tweeted a trade ban. Carney told international television that a tweet is not a law. At every single escalation, without exception, Canada's response has been faster, more legally precise, more internationally coordinated, and more structurally permanent than the prior response. This is not reaction. This is a strategy executing against a plan. And the plan has been working in the specific sense that matters most. Canada has not capitulated. Canada has not been seen to capitulate. And the international community has progressively aligned with Canada's legal and procedural position at each successive stage. Here's where things stand right now. The 72-hour clock is running, and the administration has no clean legal instrument to implement the ban. Canada has formally declined to treat the tweet as a legal instrument and has continued governing. 3 G7 allies have called Ottawa. 5 allied governments have convened coordination calls. The dollar is weaker, gold is higher. A Republican Senate committee chairman has publicly questioned the legal authority. American businesses with Canadian supply dependencies are consulting lawyers. The USMCA dispute panel proceeding is moving on its own timeline, entirely unaffected by anything appearing on Truth Social. And the international legal record Canada has been building since the first tariff escalation has never been more comprehensive or more consequential. Keep a close eye on 9:03 a.m. on March 28th, the moment the 72-hour clock expires. If a formal executive order is issued before that deadline, watch the statutory authority it cites. That citation will tell you within minutes how legally defensible the action is and how quickly a federal court challenge follows. If the deadline passes without a formal order, watch how the White House frames the non-implementation, because the framing will tell you whether the administration understands what just happened or is still operating on the belief that a tweet accomplished something. Keep a close eye on Senate Finance Committee Chairman Crapo, because his statement was not a throwaway line, and his committee's response to any formal instrument will be the most significant congressional signal on executive trade authority since the USMCA ratification. And keep a close eye on Ottawa, because Carney has demonstrated in every single episode of this confrontation that Canada's response apparatus is faster, more legally grounded, and more internationally coordinated than the West Wing anticipated. And there is no structural reason the next response will be different. Here's the reality. Donald Trump posted 47 words declaring Canada banned. Mark Carney responded live on international television that a tweet is not a law. Financial markets confirmed his analysis within 20 minutes. 3 allied finance ministers called Ottawa. A Republican Senate chairman questioned the legal authority. The White House counsel's office scrambled for a statutory vehicle. American businesses consulted lawyers. And Canada was governing, executing its energy independence framework, building its international supply partnerships, advancing its USMCA legal record, and demonstrating, for the 5th time in this confrontation, that preparation beats improvisation every single time. This is not a news cycle. This is a constitutional reckoning in full public view, with a 72-hour clock running toward an expiration that will define the boundaries of American executive trade authority for years to come. The legal clocks are running. The markets have priced it. The allies have made their calls. The Republican chairman has issued his warning. And the distance between 47 words on a social media platform and the enforceable law of the United States has never mattered more to American credibility, American governance, and America's standing as a nation that means what it says and says what it means. The stakes have never been higher. The legal exposure has never been more publicly documented. And the gap between a tweet and a law has never carried more consequence for the future of American leadership in the world. Pause for a second and hit that like button if you are finding value in this coverage. This is history, and you are watching it. 3 forward scenarios. Scenario 1, fragile calm. The 72-hour clock expires. No formal executive order is issued. The White House blames media misinterpretation and claims the tweet achieved its intended effect despite no Canadian movement. Both sides declare victory. The immediate crisis passes, but every allied capital now operates with a permanently updated model of American credibility. The precedent stands. The next tweet will be met with the same response. The surface fix conceals deeper structural stress. Scenario 2, catastrophic escalation. A formal executive order issues, citing IEEPA, declaring Canada an unusual and extraordinary threat. Federal court challenges file within hours. A judge issues a temporary restraining order before the ban takes effect. The president attacks the judiciary. Allies formally coordinate retaliatory measures. Markets price sustained uncertainty. A miscalculation on one side meets a multiplier effect on the other. The confrontation becomes a constitutional crisis with international dimensions. Scenario 3, cold strategic reset. The clock expires without implementation. The administration, recognizing its legal exposure, pivots to a different framework, demanding USMCA renegotiation under threat of withdrawal. Canada, having demonstrated its legal and strategic capacity, agrees to negotiate, but from a position of strength with international coordination already in place. The result is a reordering of North American trade relations on terms that permanently constrain unilateral executive authority. New rules, new precedents, a different balance of power. Was this the moment Allied governments learned to treat American threats as noise rather than signal, or the opening miscalculation of something far larger? If this update added value, support the channel. Subscribe to Prime Update and stay informed. Thank you for watching.